I must say, I do have concerns about any media organization which is a home to voices advocating white supremacy. That is a real threat to Canadians.
Canada's foreign minister tried to block me from a press conference at the Defend Media Freedom Conference last week. I want to show you what happened in that press conference after Chrystia Freeland was forced to back down on her attempts to censor me after the mainstream media threatened to boycott her. By now, I'm sure you've all heard the story of how at a press freedom conference in the United Kingdom, Canada's foreign minister, Chrystia Freeland, tried to exclude me and Andrew Lawton from the True North Centre from attending Freeland's one and only media availability. To my shock and pleasant surprise, the mainstream media raised holy hell on our behalf. Just watch.
Okay, so Global Mail, Global, CTV, Al Jazeera, CBC, and the National can come with me, please. And the others?
What about the rest?
The rest of us?
The rest will have to see that.
No, I think we all go.
That's
all
nonsense.
Go.
No, go.
That is nonsense. No, go.
Let's
take us to the room and we can see if we can.
No, we're not going, Brittany. We're just not.
We're all going.
This is a media freedom conference.
Yeah, this is ridiculous.
We just don't do that.
Yeah, we're not going then.
Now, what you haven't seen yet was what happened in that eventual press conference once Andrew and I finally got in that afternoon in London. By then, I had spent nearly 2 full days of my life listening to Freeland, other politicians, ambassadors, diplomats, and NGOs all tell me how much they care about threats to the media and just how dangerous it is for governments to demonize journalists and media outlets when they are simply just trying to do their jobs and speak truth to power. I'd watched Freeland dodge reporters waiting backstage for her twice and leave the stage without taking questions from journalists or the crowd at least twice. And I just wanted to ask her one question. I wanted to know if Freeland actually cared about freedom of the press back home in Canada, or did she only pretend to care when she was in front of the world and hanging out with Emil Clooney in London? Now the journalists had been waiting for nearly an hour for Freeland to show up so they could ask their questions, and I think I was the second last person in the queue of journalists. Here's how it went down. Just watch.
Minister Freeland, all of our reporters have been blocked by the United Nations, preventing us from reporting at any of their conferences, both the COP, climate change conferences, and at the Migration Pact conference. We know through writing, the UN confirmed to us that was done at the request of the Canadian government. We also know that your government has met with our competitors in the Parliamentary Press Gallery to block our organization from reporting on events organized and managed by the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Your government has also been admonished by the Information Commissioner, the Privy Council Office in particular, that for blocking our access to information requests into the Prime Minister's office. What are you going to do tangibly to change that when you get home?
Well, your question presupposes certain actions, which I haven't committed to. But let me simply say that you are here asking me a question, and that's my choice and my decision. And I certainly think at a media freedom conference, it's appropriate to have everyone who wants to ask a question, ask a question. I do also think that it is important for governments, for countries, for multilateral organizations to be thoughtful about media organizations that are truly independent and truly impartial. And I must say, I do have concerns about any media organization which is a home to voices advocating white supremacy. That is a real threat to Canadians. Thank you.
So Freeland thinks the Rebel, Jewish owned, Jewish operated, Employing a staunch philo-Semite like me with 2 fact-finding trips to Israel under our belts, rebel media, is sympathetic to white supremacy. Is she crazy? You have to be a special kind of insane to call a Jewish-owned company sympathetic to white supremacy. I don't know about you, but it sure looked like to me that Freeland didn't want to answer my question about how her government has repeatedly failed on press freedom back in Canada. So instead, she decided to demonize the journalist asking the question, just like she told me politicians should never do all week long. By the way, speaking of sympathetic to white supremacy, if I were Canada's foreign minister, I would be a little more restrained and careful in tossing out that unfounded accusation, given Freeland's own family history. Freeland's grandfather was a Ukrainian Nazi propagandist during World War II. Freeland tried to write off her own family's past as just Russian disinformation, but her grandpa, Michael Chomiak, was indeed a Nazi collaborator. And this isn't Russian propaganda. The information comes directly from the Ukrainian archival records held by the province of Alberta. And that information was cited in the Ottawa Citizen. It reads, during the Nazi occupation, Chomiak was the editor of Krakowski Listy, published first in Krakow and then in Vienna before coming to Canada. And according to that Ottawa Citizen article, the Los Angeles Holocaust Museum has even more details about these propagandist newspapers working for the Nazis. The editorial boards carried out a policy of soliciting Ukrainian support for the German cause. It was typical within these publications not to give any accounts of the German genocidal policy, and largely the editions resorted to silencing the mass killing of Jews in Galicia. Ukrainian newspapers presented the Jewish question in light of the official Nazi propaganda corollary to the Jewish world conspiracy. And the newspaper Chomiak ran, well, it had to be eventually published in Vienna because Chomiak fled as Russian forces were advancing and executing or arresting Nazi collaborators. So here is Freeland honoring her Nazi collaborating grandpa in a series of tweets a couple years ago. So that's Freeland's own family history of white supremacy, and I don't have any of that in my background since my family fought for the Allies. But let's get a little more recent, shall we? Freeland had her own sympathy, or at least her own apathy, for ethnic and religious supremacy on display at the Media Freedom Conference. That's the same conference where she said we give a platform to white supremacy. This fellow here is the Pakistani foreign minister. By now you may have seen the viral video of my boss, Ezra Levant, calling him a censorious thug at that conference here.
There is one.
Yes.
Very quick one.
Thanks. Actually, I'm not going to be directed by you. I'm going to ask a question to the Pakistani gentleman.
No, you're not.
Yes, I am. Because it's a Media Freedom Conference, and you're not going to shut down questions about a censor. You censored me, sir.
Right,
I have a Twitter account in Canada, and because I wrote something that traduced some Pakistani blasphemy law, you complained to Twitter, which took down my tweet in Canada. So can you explain why your Islamic supremacy in Pakistan is silencing my personal and journalistic freedom in Canada? And I know it happens in the United States too. And frankly, you sure should be embarrassed to invite a censor like this. But back to the thug. Who the hell are you to censor me in Canada? Answer.
Now, I don't like...
I know you don't, because you don't like free speech.
I don't like...
You don't like free speech.
Okay. Would you like to answer that very quickly? I just respond to you, sir. First of all, you want your sentiments to be respected. Just look at the tone and the tone you've adopted. Is that the correct way? You have a right to ask questions.
Well, then why did you censor me?
Did I censor you?
You shut down my Twitter
I
tweet.
did not.
Don't lie.
How am I responsible for that?
Because the government of Pakistan did. The government of Pakistan.
I was respectful to you.
No, you were not. You censored me.
I did not censor you.
Don't lie.
All right. Why would I lie?
Because that's what you do.
Okay. No, we don't. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Shame on you and shame on you.
You have
Shame on you and shame on you for inviting him. Shame on you. You censorious thug.
You have
You
double
censorious
standards.
thug.
And what you call freedom, at times you are projecting certain sectoral agendas.
Freeland co-hosted a media freedom conference where she not only invited the Pakistani foreign minister, but then met with him privately, a fact Freeland tried to hide from the public by excluding the Pakistani foreign minister from the official photo opportunity. But unfortunately for Freeland, the news got out in the international press about the meeting. And Freeland also gave the Pakistani foreign minister a prominent opportunity to whitewash Pakistan's crackdown on freedom of the press and freedom of expression on a plenary panel, one that Ezra just wandered into. The Pakistanis are barely one step down from Saudi Arabia and Iran when it comes to allowing free speech in their own countries. And Freeland certainly can't be ignorant of how harshly the Pakistanis crack down on free expression, given that as foreign minister, Freeland had to intervene to give asylum to a persecuted Pakistani Christian named Asia Bibi, a woman who is sentenced to death for blasphemy, for simply insulting Islam. I wonder how Asia Bibi would feel to see her new country's foreign minister inviting one of her Pakistani persecutors, an actual Islamic supremacist, to an international conference to lecture the world about free speech of all things. But we'll never know, because Asia Bibi's in hiding because those Pakistani extremists can still get to her here in Canada. Chrystia Freeland used her international conference and her international platform given to her by Canadian citizens in her elected capacity to tell the world a dangerous and despicable lie that a Jewish-owned company is Nazi sympathetic. Why? Because we tried to hold her accountable for her own record. Not only is that insane, but it will only serve to incite violence against us. Violent left-wing extremists like Antifa wander around the streets with weapons and face masks, looking for so-called Nazis and white supremacists to punch. And any Nazi will do, even if that Nazi isn't one at all, but rather just an Israel-loving conservative, maliciously libeled by their own government. Freeland has just given Antifa their mythical Nazis to punch, even though at The Rebel we routinely get called rabbi media because we're just a little too pro-Israel for some liberal and NDP voters. Now, if I get another chance to question Freeland one more time in a press conference, maybe I'll ask her just how many times she'd like to see me assaulted in the course of my work as a journalist. Because Freeland's dangerous, irresponsible, and completely untrue rhetoric in that press conference in London just put me and the rest of my colleagues in even more danger at work than we already are. For the Rebel.media, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. To see all of our coverage of the Defend Media Freedom Conference in London, you can go to mediafreedomconference.com, and while you're there, you can pitch in to cover the cost to send Ezra and I to that conference to show you just what a bunch of fake news it really was. Again, that's at mediafreedomconference.com.